I'm delighted to say joining us live in the studio for more on the whole situation across the Middle East is Fawaz Gerges, Professor of International Relations at the London School of Economics. Fawaz, thank you very much indeed for your time. Lovely to have you in Istanbul. Lovely to have you in the studio. Let's start in Lebanon then. We've seen a number of incidents, skirmishes, violations or accusations of that on both sides. Were these to be expected? And do you think they put the ceasefire in doubt or not enough to perhaps threaten the process?
Well, let me give you the context to your question. The Israeli Prime Minister twice in the past 2 days, in interviews on Israeli television, he said, quote unquote, "This is the end of the intense phase of fighting, but the war does not end." Translation, that Israel will basically continue to attack targets based on its own evaluation and estimate of the threats. And the United States, it seems, has given Israel assurances that Israel will take action into their own hand when and if it perceives threat to its own security in Lebanon. So I fear that the ceasefire is not only fragile and tenuous, that the ceasefire really remains at the mercy of Israel's calculation of threats to its own security from Lebanon.
So you're predicting a very, very gradual withdrawal of Israeli troops over that 60 days until they finally do pull out of southern Lebanon?
Absolutely. I mean, Israel says that Hezbollah has violated the ceasefire. The Lebanese Prime Minister and the army have made it very clear that Israel has violated the ceasefire multiple times. When Israel says Hezbollah has violated the ceasefire, it's desperate Lebanese citizens who are trying to go to their towns and villages. Anyone that tries to go to their villages is part of Hezbollah. This tells you about the mindset of Israel. And the reality is you have 1.4 million Lebanese displaced people who really want to go back home. I mean, it's winter, they are desperate, they have no shelter. But the reality is Israel yesterday, attacked a target far away from the south, on Tyre, because it says, quote unquote, that Hezbollah was trying to locate or some mid-range missiles.
The big question right now is that will a ceasefire in Lebanon lead potentially to a ceasefire in Gaza, or what effect, if any, there will be on what's happening in Gaza? The hope, of course, is that one would lead to another. The fear is that Israel will give its forces time to regroup, rearm, and then redouble its efforts in Gaza.
In fact, if you listen to the Biden administration officials, they say, even Jack Sullivan, the U.S. National Security Council official, he said, well, the ceasefire in Lebanon paved the way for a ceasefire in Gaza. Yet there's a consensus among observers the reverse will happen. Benjamin Netanyahu has made it very clear. He will deepen his control of Gaza. You're going to see more escalation. And the reality is what Israel has done in Gaza now is long-term occupation. That Israel is not going to pull out in Gaza either this year or next year. And in fact, some of the Netanyahu's more extremist coalition members plan to really establish settlements in Gaza.
Well, and mentioning those and going back to Benjamin Netanyahu's comments, why do you think he would say those words? What was it he said, that the conditions were more favourable now for a hostage deal in Gaza? Why would he open the door to that conversation, given how much pressure he is under from within his own party?
On his own terms. Again, Benjamin Netanyahu and the Americans and his coalition believe that Hamas will accept anything, that Hamas will accept a partial ceasefire, that Hamas basically will surrender, that Hamas will leave the Gaza Strip. But Hamas has made it very clear. In fact, 2 days ago, one of the top Hamas members made it very clear. We are willing and ready for a ceasefire, but a permanent ceasefire, pulling out of Israeli forces for the hostages. But what Israel wants, it wants its hostages back, and it has the right to, but it wants to reoccupy the Gaza Strip. And Hamas will never accept surrender, laying out its arm, giving the hostages, and basically allowing Israeli forces to reoccupy Gaza.
So we've got a stalemate then on positions, essentially, because 3 weeks ago, Qatar pulled out of the process as a mediator because it suggested that neither side was showing willingness to row back on any of its demands. Is there any evidence that that position has changed?
The big picture for your own audience. I fear, and I hope I'm wrong, Gaza is a long war. We're talking about a decade, not a year. Israel will never pull out of Gaza. This is a war of attrition. Hamas has positioned itself for a long war, even though you have a catastrophe in Gaza, Israel has been massacring, battering, killing Palestinians, non-stop for the past 13 months. And as you said, now more than 44,000 Palestinians who have been killed, more than 100,000, hospitals, clinics, libraries, universities. It's a wasteland. And well, look, the world has forgotten Gaza, literally. Gaza is left to survive on its own with no really major intervention on the part of the international community, including, sadly, the Arab states, not only the United States, that has been feeding the war, Israel war for the past 13 months.
Yeah, although I would point out that demonstrations around the world continue to happen in cities, outside embassies, at universities, educational facilities. So people have not completely forgotten it, but I understand where you're coming from. The news agenda will move on, and sometimes that does happen.
You're absolutely correct. Israel has already lost the war in the court of public opinion. Israel now is accused of committing crimes against humanity, war crimes, and starvation as a weapon of war. And Israel stands accused before the International Court of Justice of committing genocide. So Gaza is not forgotten. I'm talking about the states and the leading powers. As long as the United States feeds Israel's war, as long as the United States shelters Israel, as long as Germany and Britain and France, to a lesser extent, shield and Benjamin Netanyahu, the war will go on without intervention by the United States. The key power that feeds this particular war, Netanyahu and his coalition will continue their murderous wars in Gaza.
And it will be interesting to see what becomes of those ICC arrest warrants that are ongoing for Benjamin Netanyahu and his former defence minister. Fawaz, we have to leave it there. Pleasure to have you in the studio. Thanks very much indeed. Fawaz Gerges there, Gerges from the London School of Economics.